That led me to the mystery of understanding how we can begin to influence or change our mind. Because if you're able to harness a greater ability of mindfulness, you should be able to exert greater effects on your world. And if you can begin to observe a vision that represents a future, and you can hold steadfast to that vision, and you can see that vision clearly in your mind, and every day you understand where you place your attention is where you place your energy, then you would be investing your energy into the future. And the image that you see could literally be the template for trillions and trillions of atoms to organize into patterns of information called an event in your life. And so, but it's not enough to just have a clear intention, because clear intentions have very little effect on the nature of reality. That the driving force that couples the co-maiden, the handmaiden to all of that is an elevated emotion. That when people start to open their hearts and they move out of those limited states of anger and frustration and prejudice and impatience and hatred and judgment and fear, it's those emotions that cause us to feel more like matter and less like energy, separate from that field. The very nature of those chemicals cause us to define reality with our senses as materialists. So we're only looking for the particle instead of possibility. But when you start to open your heart and you go contrary to the jungle, because it's not a good idea to open your heart when there's predators and danger out there. And this is what mystics and the great charismatic leaders have talked about for many, many years, is that you have to lay down the very thing you used your whole life to get what you want for something greater to occur. You have to begin to do what's unnatural. And so when you combine that clear intention with an elevated emotion, it is the elevated emotion that begins to amplify the field around your body. And in that moment, you become more energy and less matter. And if you understand then that the emotion then is the handmaiden to the creative process, that means that you would have to feel whole before your healing. That would mean that you would have to feel abundance before your wealth. That means you would have to feel awe before the mystical moment. That would mean you'd have to feel love before your new relationship. That would mean you'd have to feel empowered before your success. And that means then when we do this properly, then we're no longer functioning as materialists. We are literally function as quantum minds. And so the research now has proven, and we've done enough research in our own studies as well, that you can change your brain. And that when you begin to go inward, and you look at the garden of your mind, you have to look at, before you plant a new garden, those plants from the past, from last year. You got to look at the weeds that have grown because you haven't been paying attention. You got to look at those rocks that have sifted to the top that represent your emotional blocks. You got to look at those trees that need some pruning. You got to look at that soil that's become hardened and rigid, fixed and habituated. And you have to light a match in a dark place, and you got to begin the process. And pulling out the weeds that are the old thoughts that slip by our awareness takes awareness. And consciousness is awareness, and awareness is paying attention. We have to look at those rocks that have sifted to the top and remove those emotional blocks. Because we can. We have to pull the past away. We have to tenderize and break down the rigidity of that soil. And now it's time to plant a garden. And it takes time for the garden to grow. It takes attention to nurture it. It takes paying attention to those weeds that want to come up. And every season, you're going to have to prune it. And every season, you're going to have to care for it. And there's never an end to the garden that we grow. And so you, subjective mind, have a consciousness, because the brain will never change the brain. And I've studied it enough times to tell you that the mind will never change the brain, because the mind is the brain in action. But who's doing the changing of the brain and the mind? And it's that nasty 13-letter word that scientists hate called consciousness. You, the immaterial aspect of you, that individual journeyman or journeywoman on the journey back to source, using a brain and body to produce different levels of mind. And only when you're truly conscious and truly aware are you beginning to affect the nature of reality. And taking small moments in your busy life to understand that when your consciousness merges with a greater consciousness, when you're connected to source, you will emulate the divine. And how would the divine live if it was you? Thanks for listening.